You've heard the idea that blacks were supposed to get 40 acres and a mule after slavery, right? But the question is that the truth? What's the history behind this claim, and how did it come about? That's what we're going to go over in today's commentary. So pay attention as we continue our studies in Dr. Leon Litwack's 1979 book, Been in the Storm So Long, The Aftermath of Slavery. Here's the answer.
Every colored man will be a slave and feel himself a slave.
A black soldier insisted.
Until he can raise him own bale of cotton and put him own mark upon it and say, "This is mine."
All of this was taking place after the Civil War in 1865, where the Southern society was in a phase of reconstruction and Negroes were in search of a new way of life after slavery, right? They knew they needed their own land to be self-sufficient. Although often expressed vaguely, as if to talk about it openly might be unwise, the expectation many ex-slaves shared in the aftermath of the war was that
something extraordinary
would soon intervene to reshape the course of their lives. Here we go. In the Jubilee they envisioned, the government provided them with 40-acre lots and thereby emancipated them from dependency on their former masters. That's what many of them envisioned or imagined. And we'll see how this idea popped up in their mind as we continue. But this idea of being given 40 acres ended up becoming a very strong belief.
This was no slight error, no trifling idea.
A Freedmen's Bureau officer reported from Mississippi in 1865.
But a fixed and earnest conviction as strong as any belief a man can ever have.
So strong that it has been passed on for multiple generations, and many of their descendants still believe it. The feeling was sufficiently pervasive, in fact, to prompt thousands of freedmen in late 1865 to hold back on any commitment of their labor until the question of land had been firmly resolved. The only real question among some blacks was not whether the lands belonging to the former slaveholders would be divided and distributed, but when and how. Not a question of if it were true or not, but simply a matter of when the land was going to be broken up and given to them, right? It's about to get wild, so pay attention. Freedmen in South Carolina heard that the large plantations along the coast were to be distributed. Equally persistent reports suggested that the lands on which the ex-slaves were working would be divided among them. Few blacks in Mississippi, a Bureau officer reported in November 1865, expressed any interest in hiring themselves out for the next year.
Nearly all of them have heard that at Christmas government is going to take the planters' lands and other property from them and give it to the colored people, and that in this way they are going to begin to farm on their own account.
In a Virginia community, the freedmen had reportedly deposited their savings with responsible persons so as to be in the most advantageous position to purchase lots of
the confiscated land as soon as the government ready to sell it.
And in Georgia, a black laborer was so certain that he coolly offered to sell to his former master the share of the plantation he expected to receive after the division. Although confident of retaining their lands, planters expressed growing concern over the extent to which the freedmen's aspirations interfered with the normalization of agricultural operations. The planters wanted to get Negroes back on the farm to tend to the crops. And this idea of Negroes coming into some land was interfering with them doing that, because apparently some of the Negroes were holding off working until they got this land that they believed was coming to them. It proved difficult to raise crops when laborers went about stuffed with the idea of proprietorship and the anticipation of soon becoming their own employers.
You cannot beat into their thick skulls that the land and everything else does not belong to them.
A South Carolina planter wrote his daughter, "I can imagine that Negroes felt a certain way because this group here was fresh out of slavery, and they had worked many years without reaping any of the benefits. So when slavery ended, they felt like many things did in fact belong to them since they had worked for it, right?" Since many whites refused to believe their blacks capable of formulating perceptions of freedom, they blamed the land mania on fanatical abolitionists, incendiary preachers, and the Yankee invaders. But those who had overheard the curious wartime discussions in which the blacks apportioned the lands among themselves knew better, as did the victims of black expropriation. Where planters had fled, abandoning their properties, the freed slaves had in numerous instances seized control, and they gave little indication after the war of yielding their authority to the returning owners. Along the Savannah River, blacks under the leadership of Abelard Shig seized 2 major plantations on the assumption that they were entitled to 40 acres and a mule. They felt that something was owed to them, and from their perspective, they were right. But convincing the Southern whites and the government of that perspective was a completely different thing altogether. And they could not do that, which is why federal troops had to be called in to dislodge them. Elsewhere, similar seizures revealed the intensity of black feelings about the land and created a volatile situation that many native whites and federal officials feared might erupt into armed confrontations. As if to confirm black land aspirations, the federal government adopted an ambitious settlement program in direct response to the thousands of unwanted and burdensome freed slaves who had attached themselves to the Union Army in the wake of General Sherman's march to the sea. On January 12, 1865, Sherman and Secretary of War Stanton conferred with 20 black ministers and church officers in Savannah to ascertain what could be done about these people. The delegation suggested that land was the key to black freedom.
We want to be placed on land until we are able to buy it and make it our own,
the spokesman for the group declared. So this spokesman wasn't talking about being given land. He suggested that Negroes be placed on land until they were able to buy it, right? Which is different from the idea of the government just giving someone 40 acres and a mule. Several days later, Sherman issued Special Field Order Number 15, a far-reaching document that set aside for the exclusive use of the freedmen a strip of coastal land abandoned by Confederate owners between Charleston, South Carolina, and Jacksonville, Florida, granting black settlers possessory titles to 40-acre lots. This was a section of about 400,000 acres of land, which was to be shared by a certain number of free Negroes and subdivided into plots that were no larger than 40 acres. And I've seen numbers ranging from 20 to 40,000 Negroes that this was intended for, while there were roughly 4 million Negroes in total at that time. Although intended only to deal with a specific military and refugee problem, the order encouraged the growing impression among the freedmen that their Yankee liberators intended to provide them with an essential undergirding for their emancipation, meaning this gave other Negroes the impression that the Northerners not only helped to free them, but were also going to give them land to support themselves after emancipation. That impression gained still further credence when Congress made the newly established Freedmen's Bureau the custodian of all abandoned and confiscated land, largely the land seized for non-payment of the direct federal tax or belonging to disloyal planters who had fled. And that's who owned the land that was provided to the several thousand blacks earlier. It was confiscated land that belonged to the Confederates who ran off during the Civil War. Ex-slaves and loyal Unionists could preempt 40-acre lots, rent them at nominal rates for 3 years, and purchase them within that period at a fair price, about 16 times the annual rent. Dr. Litwack says the land was to be rented out and then paid for at market value. Now, I didn't see this in the actual order, so I'm unsure where he is basing this statement off of. It's possible that he's referring to the meeting between Sherman and the black ministers and church officers that took place prior to Sherman releasing the order, right? But this is what he says. If the Bureau had implemented this provision, and if blacks had been able to accumulate the necessary funds, some 20,000 black families would have been provided with the means for becoming self-sustaining farmers. To apportion the large landed estates among those who worked them and who had already expended years of uncompensated toil made such eminent sense to the ex-slave that he could not easily dismiss this aspiration as but another exaggerated or absurd view of freedom.
My master has had me ever since I was 7 years old, and never give me nothing,
observed a 21-year-old laborer in Richmond.
I worked for him 12 years, and I think something is due me.
And in fairness, I do believe something was owed to these people that were freed from slavery. I think they should have been given at least something to help them climb out of the pit. But many of the whites did not see it like that, right? They believed that the blacks had already been compensated with civilization and Christianity. Expecting nothing from his old master, he now trusted the government to do
something for us.
And many years later, the government did offer welfare programs and other type of preferential treatment for blacks, but nothing much at all when the people really needed it after slavery. The day a South Carolina rice planter anticipated trouble was when one of his field hands told him that
the land ought to belong to the man who alone could work it,
not to those who
sit in the house
and profit by the labor of others. Such sentiments easily translated into the most American of aspirations.
All I want is to get to own 4 or 5 acres of land that I can build me a little house on and call my home,
A Mississippi black explained. With the acquisition of land, the ex-slave viewed himself entering the mainstream of American life, cultivating his own farm and raising the crops with which to sustain himself and his family. That was the way to respectability in an agricultural society, and the freedman insisted that a plot of land was all he required to lift himself up.
Give us our own land and we take care of ourselves. But without land, the old masters can hire us or starve us as they please.
Which was a good point. Without land at that time, Negroes were left depending on others who had the land. And what better way to confirm their emancipation than to own the very land on which they had been working, and which they had made productive and valuable by their own labor. The expectation of 40 acres and a mule may have been sheer delusion, but the freedmen had sufficient reason to think otherwise. Since the outbreak of the war, many of them had overheard their masters talk in fearful tones about how the Yankees, if successful, would divide up the land among the blacks. The Freedmen's Bureau, in fact, blamed the false expectations of land on Confederate slaveholders who had exploited the fear of confiscation during the war to arouse propertied whites to greater exertions and sacrifices. The deception was deliberately cultivated in some instances by planters who were determined to keep their ex-slaves until the post-war crops had been harvested. At least, numerous disappointed freedmen recalled how they had been assured the federal government would grant them plots of land after the completion of the agricultural season. When the Yankees finally arrived, they reinforced the land fever by assuring the freed slaves of their right to 40 acres and a mule. When a Union soldier asked him if he had ever been whipped, West Turner of Virginia recalled, he had replied,
"Yes, sir, boss. Give me 30 and 9 any old time."
Upon hearing this, the soldier advised him to take 1 acre of land for each time he had been whipped and an extra acre as a bonus.
So I measure off best I could 40 acres of that cornfield and staked it out. The Yanks give all Fayette Jackson's land away to the Negroes and plenty more other C-sesh land. But when Marse Jackson come back, we had to give it all up.
So we see that the planters and the Yankees also contributed to this misunderstanding about Negroes being given land. Still further encouragement came from black soldiers and black missionaries who sought to prepare their people for the responsibilities they would soon assume and place particular emphasis on the imminent division of the lands.
It's the white man's turn to labor now.
A black preacher in Florida told an assemblage of field hands.
He ain't got nothing left but his land, and the land won't be his'n long. For the government is going to give to every 40 acres of land and a mule.
Which was not what Sherman's order said. But in his mind, he interpreted it as every Negro was going to get 40 acres and a mule. Within the first 2 years after the war, freedmen who embraced and acted upon the expectation of 40 acres and a mule learned soon enough to face up to the possibility of disappointment. When some former Alabama slaves staked off the land they had been working and claimed it as their own, the owner quickly set matters straight.
Listen, what's mine is mine, and what's yours is yours. You're just as free as I and the missus, but don't go fooling around my land.
Of course, planters derived considerable comfort from the knowledge that federal officials were prepared to confirm their property rights. Until the blacks acknowledged the futility of land expectations, the Freedmen's Bureau recognized how difficult it would be to stabilize agricultural operations. With that sense of priorities, the Bureau instructed its agents to do everything in their power to disabuse the ex-slaves of any lingering illusions about taking over their masters' lands.
This was the first difficulty that the officers of the Bureau had to contend with.
A Mississippi officer wrote,
And nothing but their efforts and explanations kept off the storm. Even now, it is but a temporary settlement.
If the blacks refused to believe their old masters, Bureau agents were quite prepared to visit the plantations in person and impart the necessary confirmation.
The government owns no lands in the state. It therefore can give away none. Freedmen can obtain farms with the money which they have earned by their labor. Everyone, therefore, shall work diligently and carefully save his wages, till he may be able to buy land and possess his own home.
The blacks he encountered held so tenaciously to their illusions, a bureau officer in Alabama observed, that,
unless they see me and hear me refute the story, they persist in the belief.
You see that? They held tightly to that belief, and understandably so. Still other officers reported that the freedmen refused to believe them too, or thought the question of land might be negotiable. After being told of the government's policy, a Virginia freedman offered to lower his expectations to a single acre of land.
If you make it the acre that Marsa's house sits on.
That was wild, wasn't it? As an alternative to confiscation, Freedmen's Bureau officers and Northern white missionaries and teachers advanced the classic mid-19th century self-help ideology and implored the newly freed slaves to heed its lessons. Rather than entertain notions of government bounties, they should cultivate habits of frugality, temperance, honesty, and hard work. If they did so, they might not only accumulate the savings to purchase land, but would derive greater personal satisfaction from having earned it in this manner. Almost identical advice permeated the editorials black newspapers, the speeches of black leaders, and the resolutions adopted by black meetings.
Let us go to work faithfully for whoever pays fairly, until we ourselves shall become employers and planters.
The Black Republican, a New Orleans newspaper, editorialized in its first issue. With an even finer grasp of American values, a black Charlestonian thought economic success capable of overriding the remaining vestiges of racial slavery.
This is the panacea which will heal all the maladies of a Negrophobia type. Let colored men simply do as anybody else in business does. Be self-reliant, industrious, producers of the staples for market and merchandise, and he will have no more trouble on account of his complexion than the white men have about the color of their hair or beards.
No matter what the freedmen were told or what precepts they were admonished to follow, the belief in some form of land redistribution demonstrated a remarkable vitality. The wartime precedents and promises were apt to speak louder in some regions than the insistent post-war denials. Thousands of ex-slaves had been placed on 40-acre tracts under Sherman's program. The earlier experiments at Davis Bend and on the Sea Islands persisted into 1865, and the stories of individual and collective success by the black settlers who worked these lands would seem to have assured the continuation and expansion of such projects. But even if few blacks elsewhere in the South knew of them, even if still fewer were aware of the congressional debate on Thaddeus Stevens' ambitious land confiscation program, or of the immense generosity of the federal government in awarding millions of acres to railroad corporations, the idea of 40 acres and a mule simply made too much sense and had become too firmly entrenched in the minds of too many freedmen for it to be given up at the first words of a bureau underling. Nor could the thousands of ex-slaves on abandoned and confiscated lands in 1865 understand that the federal policies which made their settlement possible had not been long-term commitments, but rather temporary military expedients, designed to keep them working on the plantations and away from the cities and the Union Army camps. That's what Dr. Litwack suggests was the underlying reason for this land provision. It was a temporary strategy to keep Negroes working in agriculture and away from the cities. And I believe there to have been some strategy behind it, because the ruling whites typically thought from a position of strategy more so than just pure kindness, right? I can't see any reason why General Sherman would just want to give all these Negroes all this land without it having some type of beneficial consequence for himself and the general public at large, right? And apparently it was given with the thought in mind of keeping Negroes on some type of plantation and away from the city. Resilient though they were, the hopes of the freedmen could withstand only so many shocks. when the governor of Florida told them,
"The president will not give you 1 foot of land, nor a mule, nor a hog, nor a cow, nor even a knife or fork or spoon."
he could be dismissed as a mouthpiece of planters who stood to lose the most from a confiscation scheme. When a bureau officer told some Georgia blacks essentially the same thing, one disbelieving freedman remarked,
"That's no Yank. That just some reb they dressed in blue clothes and brought him here to lie to us."
It was difficult to accept that they weren't getting any land, and understandably so. But the denials began to assume a substance that could no longer be ignored. On May 29, 1865, President Andrew Johnson announced his proclamation of amnesty, whereby most former Confederates were to be pardoned and recover any of their lands which might have been confiscated or occupied. Sherman released the order to give some Negroes land in January 1865, and by May of the same year, the President Andrew Johnson said, "No, sir, that land already belonged to people and we're giving it back to them." That had to be taken seriously as the federal officers who now prepared to implement the order. In some communities, the news coincided with a rumor, said to have been circulated by planters, that the president had revoked the Emancipation Proclamation. To many freedmen, contemplating what would happen to the lands they had worked and expected to own, that was no rumor at all. Under Johnson's magnanimous pardoning policy, any faint hope of a land division collapsed, along with the promising wartime precedents. Rather than confirm the settlers in possession of the land they had cultivated and on which they had erected their homes, the government now proposed to return the plantations to those for whom they had previously labored as slaves. Not satisfied with having their lands returned, some of the owners displayed their own brands of insolence and ingratitude by claiming damages for any alterations made by the black settlers and by suing them for back rents for the use of the land. To inform the blacks that their land aspirations were all a delusion was difficult enough, but to remove them from the lands they had come to regard as their own often required more than verbal skills. In Norfolk County, Virginia, the freedmen who had settled on Taylor's farm refused to leave, ignoring the court orders and ousting the sheriffs and federal officers who tried to enforce them. After assembling together, the blacks refused offers of compromise, questioned the president's right to pardon the original owner, and resolved to defend their property. At this meeting, Richard Parker explained to his fellow freedmen that the white man had secured this land only by forcibly expelling the Indians, and he suggested that they now exercise the same prerogative. After a pitched battle with county agents, the black settlers were finally driven off the land. And that's the deal with the 40 acres and a mule. We have General Sherman, who created an order to provide a limited number of Negroes with a limited amount of land. And then you have other Negroes who took that idea, they heard about it somehow, and they made it seem as though every Negro was promised 40 acres and a mule, right? And then you have the federal agents and planters who were also involved in spreading that rumor, right? And just as fast as the order was created, it was overturned by President Johnson, who, like many other whites, did not believe that Negroes were owed anything, right? Understand? And away that dream went. And so hopefully you have enjoyed this commentary. I thank you for your time. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.